Good evening, everyone. Across puddles and ponds, it's a great pleasure to have so many of you show so much interest, quite rightly so, in this feisty and absolutely unique remembrance of things past, which are still punctuating the history of things present. Before I launch on the evening for our book club exploration today from the Bengal Club Book Club, it is my great pleasure, privilege, and honor to hand over proceedings to our outgoing president with an incredible record in the last year, Mr. Kunal Sen. Thank you, Kunal.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you for the compliments as always. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, it's always a pleasure, a privilege, and an honor to stand on this platform and to address you all. It is more important that since the session has ended, which is generally July to June, and then comes the AGM, so it is more important for me to share my thoughts, my ideas, and how everything went during this season, and how much have we been able to achieve. Firstly, from July 22 to June 23, which is the presidential term, we had a COVID-free year. So that gave us a lot of impetus to do things the way we wanted. If we now look at the accounting period, which is irrespective of the tenure of the president, which is June to July, or rather July to June, from April 22 of the previous year to March 23 of this year, your club has made a revenue growth of 43% over the previous year. Your club has made a substantial marginal proportionate profits on the revenue. More important is the fixed deposits is currently at rupees 2340 lakhs, which is 23.40 crores, an addition of 4.30 crores over the previous year. And let me tell you, my dear members, all these have been possible because of the untiring efforts given by each of our general committee member and the subcommittee members and their team. Without the efforts, it would never have been possible. Now, the services which we give, the services which our subcommittee members give, are qualitative in nature. It cannot be touched, it cannot be felt, but you can only feel it when you translate that into the financial results. And that result speaks for itself, which I just mentioned, 43% revenue growth over previous year, the substantial profit margins, and the fixed deposit increasing over the previous year by 4.30 crores. Now, the other thing which I want to mention, that each of our committee members and the subcommittee which we have, which has brought this outstanding results over the last fiscal, comprises mainly revenue earner, if you see, mainly the entertainment, the library, and the food committee because it provides the delectable cuisine. But more important to give support to these three committees, the three major committees, the mainstream committees, are the support committees. and they are the finance and accounts who translates all these numbers, and all these are audited numbers, by the way. You will be soon receiving the audited results, or you might have received the soft copy, because the AGM is just soon, another 2 weeks to go. And these have been all the efforts of these subcommittee, and what I was talking about, the support subcommittee members, the support subcommittees, the finance and accounts, the legal, the chambers, the IT, the communication, the bar, the staff, communication and IT, the staff and the staff administrative committee, and the one more committee which we added up last year, which have been giving us tremendous results, is the procurement committee. And this procurement committee has built up its own SOP, and it is helping us to build our own internal checks and controls. Lastly, or rather I shouldn't say lastly, because there are 2-3 more to complete. Last but not the least, it is for each one of you, for each of our members who have been here, who have been supporting us with their thumping footfall, and that is how our revenues have gone so high. And it is because of these strong SOPs, these strong internal controls, and the strong procurement policy that is getting implemented, still some more work to do, we are being able to get substantial profit. We have been able to get savings in our cost because of the cost optimization. And let me tell you, my friends, that this profit, this revenue, this cash generation by which the fixed deposit have been built is mainly, it is in spite of the Charter of Demands, which had an effect from 1st January 22. So January, February, March of last year got into this. And we have stopped our membership from February this year, and will definitely take it up somewhere around this year down the line. So in spite of taking these major decisions for branding of our club, for building the image of our club, we are financially so healthy. Another thing which I would like to mention, that the entertainment, which also brings in a lot of footfalls apart from library, is the big ticket events and the medium-sized events have been all self-sponsored to the best of the ability. And that has been done all through the social network of each of the committee members and the subcommittee. I would wish that the glory, the legacy of this premier institution be upheld. And I'm positive that all the forthcoming presidents, year after year, the committees and the subcommittees will take the club to greater heights. Today being the last book club meet of this season, I cannot resist but say a few words about this book club. Dr. Julie Banerjee Mehta has been a strong motivator for initiating this book club. And she has taken to a different level and giving the platform to all the renowned authors, scholars, novelists to present their book on this platform. It is also the library committee under the chairmanship of Dr. Sandeep Chatterjee has a host of scholars and intellectuals in the subcommittee. And Library Committee of Bengal Club has also been taken to a different paradigm, which cannot be explained by words. That is also, you have to feel it, you have to sense it. So with these few words, I would like to conclude by giving my heartfelt thanks to all the members once again, and above all, the blessings of God. Thank you.
Thank you, Kunal. Please. So, what a wonderful summation of a wonderful year. And I must say a special thank you to the GC, the General Committee of this club, headed by our outgoing president, Mr. Kunal Sen. When I came back to this club, I never imagined that in 7 years it would become my second home. I used to come here with my father, who was president in 1985, Dr. Julie Banerjee, hold his hand and come up the stairs. And at that time, life was so different. Away for 35 years, back now, I thank all of you for coming here this evening. It's a sort of validation for me. And I welcome with open arms the author who has graced us today, Aanchal Malhotra, for this wonderful book. Does anyone have a copy handy? The Book of Everlasting Things. Thank you, Sangeeta. Which has really taken not just Calcutta, not just India, but I've had enormously positive reports from Canada and the US about someone who has so deftly, so audaciously connected literature with fiction. And it reminds us of Hayden White, the great philosopher, historian, and writer in the 60s, who said, Payal, if you remember, history is fiction, and fiction is history. So, 3 books to Aanchal Malhotra's credit, who has surprised the academic community by so effectively bringing the issue of the Indian partition to a global level. Partition is not just about the subcontinent, as I realized when I went to teach at the University of Toronto. The classroom was filled with immigrant children of Sri Lankan origin. As you know, you are a product of Concordia University yourself. And the history of countries such as Canada, much that I love Canada, is mired in the blotched marks of segregation, of discrimination, and partition of children from their parents, as in the residential schools of Canada and the US. The partition that we have seen in the history of the Japanese community, where 44,000 Japanese were treated, parted, segregated during the Second World War, although they were citizens of Canada. It was the same with the Komagata Maru incident, where Sikhs who traveled all the way to Canada were parted from becoming Canadian citizens, sent right back. Some of them, as some of you might have seen, the testimony to killing them at Baj Baj. And then there's the story, horrific story, of the Chinese internment, where literally, physically, families were parted from their fathers and their other male members who went to find a better life in Canada because they could not afford the enormous head tax per person. So families were parted. And the story today goes on, where you look at Sri Lanka, you look at Syria, You look at Mexico and the border between US and Canada. Partition is rife. To my great delight, we have Aanchal Malhotra, very young, in her 30s, who talks to us about not just the story of love, the story of trauma, but the story of two lovers, the eternal story where two lovers and love give us hope and light in quite a challenging world. Aanchal has written 3 books. 2 of them are non-fiction before this, and this is her debut novel. Without further ado, I would like very much to welcome Aanchal again and say thank you for coming. The first question I have for you, Aanchal. Such young shoulders carrying the burden of such a mired, conflicted history. How did you think about the subject of partition? I believe on one of your trips back from Concordia University, where you were studying printmaking. Would you like to share a little bit about that catalyst and then about your childhood?
Okay. Well, firstly, thank you so much for being here. It's so nice to see so many people out on a weekend. Well, I suppose the easy answer as to why someone so young is writing about something so old, which is a question I'm asked a lot, as you can imagine, mostly by my interviewees, is because I didn't know anything about it. I belong to a family where all 4 of my grandparents migrated from what became Pakistan and came to India, and it was just never spoken about at home, which is not an unusual thing, as I would later learn as I do my research across India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. The things that were spoken about were things that were lovely about childhood. The fruit orchards, or the friends, or Basant, or kite flying festivals, or school, or the fit-in that used to take someone from one place to another place. But really nothing that touched on the brutality of partition, and certainly nothing that talked about the difficulties in rehabilitation in an independent India or Pakistan. And you're right, I was at Concordia, I was doing my master's degree, and I took a sabbatical. And I came back to India during that sabbatical because I was due to work on a thesis, and I was quite burnt out. I was not interested in working on that thesis, and so I said, let me take a gap year, come home to India, and an idea will present itself naturally. And it was 2013, it was exactly 10 years ago actually. And I, on this trip, just came across these 2 objects that my family had carried from Lahore to Amritsar. And they were such ordinary objects. It was a ghada, a vessel in which lassi is made. You know this well because you interviewed me about this book many years ago. And there was a guz, a yardstick, which measures fabric at a clothing store. And I'm not joking, when I say they were ordinary, they were so mundane, and they were, patina covered. I think I would have seen those objects my whole life and never asked about them. And this is the beauty and also the discomfort of ordinary objects when they are old, is that they carry such incredible histories. And often we don't ask about that. So my grandfather, when he started touching these objects and talking about them, because I asked, what are these things? This caress, the texture, the sound, the metal, just hands on these old objects, it reminded him of so many things, and it felt as though he was immediately transported back to a place where these things were used in their prime. And, my nana. There were such ordinary stories like chilgoze khate the. They would eat, what is chilgoze in English? Pine nuts. Like walking on the street eating chilgoza, riding a bicycle, making lassi, watching my father use the Guz in the clothing store. It felt as though he was back in Lahore. And obviously objects have the power to transport us. And they have the power to remember people who are no longer here. But to see that happen before your eyes so seamlessly, be transported into the past, but also across this sort of untraversable border into Pakistan now, it was incredible. And I felt completely smitten by this idea that an object can take you places and an object can collect your past within it. It can lock it into itself. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I started this little research project for myself just to see what people carried and what those objects meant to people. And it was just in Delhi where I live. But the question is, how does someone so young actually start to find people so old? And if I'm young now, you can imagine me 10 years ago, even younger. So the thing with Partition is one story will always lead you to another story. And so the research is organic. And, Rituparna, you know this, you do Partition work as well, that there is it's a privilege to be let into somebody's life to talk about something so intimate. And I was let into so many people's lives. One of the families I wrote about is here, the Sanyals, and I'm so happy to see them again. But it was just, I would archive an object and it would take me somewhere else. And I think my focus was the object, but really through the object about Partition. To ask someone a question very directly, oh, you came from Pakistan or you came from India, felt very intrusive, even 70 years later. So to say, oh, you carried this ring with you, that's so interesting. Why this ring? Oh, your mother gave you this ring. Okay. Tell me about your mother. Tell me about the house. So you're trying to sort of build like a social ethnography that was left behind at the time of Partition. And obviously you become very interested not just in the violence and the difficulty around the subject, talking about it, reliving it, but also the relationships that are left behind, which is something I think is not really talked about. We are quick to think of violence when we think of Partition. We think of the trains, and it's a very unjust way to pigeonhole an event which is so vast in its emotional landscape. So the more I spoke to people, the more I realized that there were so many different kinds of relationships: friends, lovers, husband, wife, businessmen that ruptured businesses, neighbors. Samir and Firdaus's story really came out of that. That what did ordinary people feel, not the politicians making decisions, but like
you and I.
Just exactly, you and me, like my grandparents.
So, thank you for the segue which you've created. Aanchal, as we were talking today a little earlier on, this immersion in memory, memory studies is huge today. It's Department of Memory Studies is even an entity at IIT Madras. And people such as Dr. Abhishek Parui are doing great work there on post-traumatic stress and how we try in our own way, in the subconscious, to wipe away what is unhappy. And we've talked about this in our book club on your book. So my question to you is, I want you to talk a little bit about what now in the latest theoretical concept of memory studies is called post-memory. So post-memory, and I'm quoting Marianne Hirsch, with whom I work, with her work. Yes. We can inherit each other's memories. Post-memory describes the relationship that the generation after bears to the personal, collective, and cultural trauma of those who came before. So whether it's a touch, or whether it's like you were describing, the gharai, the vessel, a piece of stone, a ring would have. So how do you think, with the many stories that you have in your Jola, how do you think you would explain to us, the lay person, how that punctuated and helped you write this story?
Well, the simplest way is to say that trauma doesn't end with the generation that witnessed it. It cannot possibly. And if we think it, then we are either evading something or lying to ourselves. Because for 23 years of my life, I didn't think partition mattered to me. Actually, I didn't think anything about it. I didn't think about it. And the minute you come face to face with a tragedy that has changed the trajectory of your family or any family you intimately interact with, it will change your life as well. And post-memory is my relationship to my grandparents' relationship of partition, which means that it is a second-hand relationship. And it is very important, like, yes, of late, we are paying a lot of attention to oral testimonies of partition, of survivors. But that research never extends to descendants. Because of their distance from the site of trauma, we don't think that is a valid testimony to collect, but we need to collect it. We need to collect it. We need to understand the dissemination of partition memory through, of course, nationhood, through family, through community, through caste. We need to see how it has percolated and also presented itself in a whole different entity in the present. Absolutely. Is it being reformed in a way? Reworked, yeah. Sure. Yeah. So I was very interested in how the tragedies and experiences of people who witnessed partition percolated down to their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, something I have explored at length in my second book, and now, of course, through fiction in this novel as well. But I think that there's a lot more work to be done on this subject, because trauma presents itself not only in the manner that we think. It doesn't only present itself through longing or sadness or anger. It can also present itself through prejudice and bias, which is the more prevalent form now. And we don't really give it that label, but it is very much perhaps silence in not knowing your family history that accounts for the bias you may feel towards a particular community, imagining what may have happened. Or
even understanding a particular community.
Right. Yeah. On the other hand, there's also silence that comes from really not having anyone to ask anything to, which is more heartbreaking in a way.
True.
Yeah.
I think all that you've said makes so much sense, especially there are PhD scholars here. I know Shuddhadeep Mukherjee, who is here from Rutgers, and I know somebody from UPenn. Please, yeah. What was your name again? Yashodhara. She is also working on similar issues. I will just distract us. Gurudash, do we have the hybrid open? Is there anybody there?
Absolutely, ma'am. Absolutely.
Okay, so please let them in.
Yeah, everybody is in.
Okay, so in the hybrid, I'm looking for Ragini Chakraborty. Are you there? Why can't we see them, Gurudash?
Ma'am, it is from your end. I can see everybody from your end. It is not put in gallery mode because it's getting recorded. That's the reason. Put in gallery mode, please.
Okay, so can they speak to us?
Absolutely.
Okay. Ragini, are you there?
Hi, ma'am. Yes, I'm here.
Fantastic. She's an unofficial student, and what can I say? She's been a friend, a scholar. We've worked together. And Ragini, will you tell us a little bit about what you're working on? You're from the University of Illinois at Champaign.
Urbana-Champaign.
Urbana-Champaign, yes. Please, are you in Urbana now?
I'm actually in Los Angeles now, so it's like very early in the morning here. Sorry.
I know. Thank you for tuning in. Tell us, Ragini, exactly what you're doing so that we can have a conversation which is more meaningful to the rest of us. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for actually organizing this, and thank you so much, Aanchal, for all the meaningful work. I'm also actually working in memory studies, and I'm looking at the material aspects of memory and also intersections with gender, trauma, and biopolitics. So, I mean, while I was listening to both of your conversation and while I was reading the book, I have read all your books, and when I was reading this one, I'm actually also very interested to kind of talk more about how you are looking at the markers of memory. And I mean, it is very interesting how you bring up smell, fragrance. And I was doing a quick word search last night through the PDF in terms of looking at how you have used different words that signifies smell. Sometimes it's a stench, and sometimes it's fragrance. Sometimes it's ether. So I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about the book in terms of how um, markers of memory become so important, particularly smell, taste, how these become so important that, it reminds us of memories of violence, takes us back to memories of love, memories of I mean, also forgetting and remembering. So yeah, if we could talk a little bit about that, of your
Okay,
experiences of writing.
Ragini, absolutely brilliant. You have pinned Aanchal down. We will hear, I just want to give everybody a sense of our trajectory today. So after Aanchal finishes answering your question, what we'll do is we have a few more questions. I have a few more questions for her. And then we let our Bengal Club, book club explorers talk a little bit, ask the questions, and we'll get back to you straight after that, all of you who are aboard, right? Thank you so much for being here. And we have somebody from the UK as well there, Chris Marsh. Thank you for being here, Chris, and Urmi and everybody else. So, Anshul, go right ahead if you just want to talk a little bit about the sense of smell.
That's such an interesting question, Ragini. And I've been asked about smell before, but never really in that kind of visceral way. Any of our senses are capable of transporting us back to any place in our memory or a place that we have experienced through secondhand memory. I've seen this with myself. I've seen this with a lot of interviews I've conducted with descendants who are piecing together stories of their ancestors of partition. And it's, in a way, of course, it's kind of unexplainable, isn't it? That something so invisible as smell, not even taste. Taste is like a physical thing. Smell is invisible. Can take us back to sometimes the most powerful memories that we have, particularly of people who are no longer with us. Like if I say the smell of cold cream, Pond's cream, everyone knows it reminds it of their grandmothers. That kind of leathery, soft feeling on your hands when you put it. Your grandmother used to do it. Or like the powder, the smell of the powder they put on their face, or, stuff like that. With Samir particularly, smell is the marker for everything and everyone, not just Firdaus, not just Lahore, but everything and everyone. Smell becomes a marker for his wife. Smell becomes a marker for his aunt that he never knew. Smell also becomes a marker for the imagined land, because the land that Samir leaves behind, he makes it up in his mind, right? The imagined homeland is always more beautiful than reality. And he spends more time thinking about that past than the time the past actually happened. This is something he says to his granddaughter. And then what do the two of them do? They recreate an entire person through a smell, through the smell of a rose. And he builds that from scratch, right? There's no rose in the perfume that they're making. He builds the rose without a rose. He creates it from memory. I am not very well versed with the vocabulary of smell, though I find your question really interesting. So to be able, and the vocabulary of smell is really specific. Even those three words you used, scent, stench, fragrance, ether is a thing. They all mean different things. So where they are used with intention to provide you context to that thing. There are other words, odor, perfume. And these I could have only gathered by spending time with someone who spends time with smell. So for 5 years, I shadowed a perfumer. Yeah, it's a bit obsessive. I don't know how she felt about it, but it was really interesting to have esoteric conversations with someone about something you can't see, right? Because her sense of smell is so powerful that she needs to work on it not being an assault for her. She divides her time between India and Paris. When we met in Paris, I remember once we were walking on the street, we passed a gentleman, she said, "Oh, did you smell that pumpkin?" I was like, "No, I did not smell that pumpkin." She goes, "That man was, just hints of pumpkin were following him." I was like, "There were no hints of pumpkin." You know? So these esoteric conversations about things that you cannot see but are so abstract, and they point to sort of signifiers of memory, is really interesting. What I also learned from her is we understand perfumes as combinations of certain smells. But as perfumers, they learn how to deconstruct those smells. So she would offer me a rose and say, "What do you smell?" And I would say, "Well, I smell a rose." And she goes, "Well, what kind of rose? Is it a powdery rose? Is it a trampled rose? Is it an Indian rose? Is it a dark pink rose? Is it a lemony rose? Can you smell the cloves in the rose?" And these were questions that I had never considered, the excavation of a single smell that you take for granted. Because this is the thing, we take our sense of smell for granted, but imagine if we didn't have it tomorrow. We would stop enjoying life. No, it's true, we really would, because we enjoy what we eat because of what it smells like. If something stops smelling, like a food stops smelling, you don't know whether it's bad, you don't know whether it's cooked, you know a flower is beautiful because it smells sweet. And these are things that are inbuilt, they are innate within us. But imagine tomorrow we didn't have our sense of smell. Try it. I don't know how you would try it.
That would be very hard for someone
COVID,
like...
exactly, COVID.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
This is a good example. This is a great example, in fact. So I don't really remember what your question was, but the thing is that I needed to spend time with someone who spent time with smell to be able to do justice to this story and have it be real. And that even goes for like the ingredients of different perfumes that my characters use. So all of the perfumes in the book are real perfumes that the perfumer I worked with has made. So should someone want to smell them, they can go somewhere and actually smell them, right? And I thought this was really important, to have a reality to fiction.
I think it was brilliantly done, and I'm sure...
Thank you.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question. Yeah.
I think it's quite interesting that we dove into the sense of smell so quickly in my conversation with you, because obviously that's what strikes the reader the most. We have a tea taster here, Sangeeta Kichlu, and we have several people who are interested in the art of making perfumes. One of them is a chemical engineer, Bengal Club member, book reader, Urmi Sinha. We'll come back to her later. We also have Anasuya Pal and Anju Munshi, who are also avid readers, and they have talked about the sense of smell in the book. I want to share, and I want to ask you something that will point, I hope, us towards the fabulous work you're doing with the Museum of Material Memory. But before I go to that, I want to tell you that when the Fifth Avenue perfume was being created, the Elizabeth Arden House, the person who put a stamp on that, I was very lucky to be able to speak to him. And I was in Singapore, I think, 1993, when I was a young rookie reporter sent to interview him. And he said it was called Fifth Avenue because the perfumer who was walking down Fifth Avenue smelt something which made him go mad. He ran after the woman in front of Macy's, stopped her and said, "Could you please tell me what you're wearing?" And she said, "I have no idea. I sort of put on 3 layers of 3 different fragrances." And he said the hardest thing was, as you said, the sense of the olfactory is not in any way graspable. With food, you can say, okay, deconstruct. These are the molecules. But how do you do that with perfume?
No, you can. Like scientists do that.
Yes,
this
but
is their job.
if it's wafting in the air,
exactly.
you know, it's very hard, Aanchal. So, leading to the question on your Museum of Material Memory that you created, tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So the museum is a digital archive which looks at family heirlooms and objects of antiquity through the stories of those objects. It stems from many roots, I guess. One of them is the fact that we all have aged objects in our home that are collecting dust that we don't know anything about. The second is when people from the subcontinent or any ethnic community go to larger museums like the British Museum, they see things on the shelves and on the walls that are in our houses with labels like Inkwell, India, 19th century, with no story and no history and no geography and no context. And it's very triggering, but also it's very disrespectful of the history of that object, which can be beautiful and complicated, not only the history of how it got to that museum, but the history before it as well. So the Museum of Material Memory strives to honor the stories of objects as primary characters in people's homes, not something that the home is built around or something that just stays on a shelf. So we invite, you know, people from India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Afghanistan, all the countries that make up the subcontinent, Maldives as well, to write stories about objects that are in their home that they would like to know more about, and through that story know the history of their family a little more and how it connects to them. And the reason why it is digital is because there's no physical space where all of these countries could possibly honor each other's histories in a dignified manner.
Thank you for shedding so much light on that aspect of your other work, the other hat that you wear, so to speak. I'm interested very much, as I think many of us would be here, if you could tell us a little bit about the stories. You know, I was driven to tears about that story of the woman who said to you that she wanted to talk to you about a bartan, but it was not that she wanted to talk about a bartan at all. Tell us about that, Aanchal. And also, what I found fascinating was a story where you literally connected Sikhs with Muslims, with that woman who used to live in Dalhousie and said she wanted very much to know what happened to that house and who was living there. So, yes, so please.
Sometimes you don't really know what you're going to find when you do field work. It was 2014, I was in Lahore. I had found a contact of a woman who said, I have these utensils, these old Kashmiri utensils that I got as in my trousseau. Would you come and see them? She was in Pakistan. The utensils were from India, so I said, yeah, of course, I'll come and see them. I was in her home in Lahore, and she was talking about the utensils, but she wrapped up that conversation very quickly. She was like, oh, this is bartan, whatever. I really want to talk to you about my house. I said, okay. She proceeded to tell me this story about how her father, who used to then, he was the first Muslim vice chancellor of Punjab University, and he, with great love, built this house in Dalhousie before partition. And you know this because it's very, very difficult to build a house in the hills. And so she said it took him several years and he had to get many permissions, but he loved the house. And it was a house with green shutters. It was a house that had a rounded side. She kept describing this house. And she said, you know, at some point before partition, in the summer before partition, we all went to that house for summer holidays. And there were rumors that Dalhousie would be a part of Pakistan. And this was because Gurdaspur district, which made up quite a substantial part of Punjab at the time, was over 51% Muslim. So the assumption that Dalhousie, which was in Gurdaspur district, would be a part of Pakistan was right on her behalf. And so she tells me that I remember on 14th August, the Pakistani flag went up in Gandhi Chowk in Dalhousie, and then 3 days later on 17th August, it came down. This happened in many places, Malda included. These places celebrate independence a few days later, which is a fascinating history in itself. Now, the reason, okay, fine, so the flag comes down, and as you would have at Dalhousie, if anyone knows the history of Dalhousie, it was basically a sanatorium town for the British. All of these hill stations were. But Dalhousie specifically had a large population of landed and wealthy Muslim gentry that had been given homes and lands, and this is where they would holiday in the summer. So a lot of these wealthy Muslim families were in Dalhousie, like this lady I spoke to, Mrs. Ali. And Mrs. Ali said that when we found out that it was in fact a part of India, we were all, rambling. We were rushing to get out, and my husband came from Punjab to get me, and he took me, and my father stayed behind because, that house was so precious to him. He had to lock up the house, he had work to do. So our father locks up this house, and he comes to Pakistan. And then several decades later, family friends go to India. They happen to go to Dalhousie, and they take a photo of the house. And she shows me this photo. She goes, look, this is the photo. It's black and white. It's so beautiful. And she said, there was nobody in the house at the time, but they did tell me that 2 Sikh gentlemen live in that house. I said, okay. So then I came back to India. I wrote the story. The book was published. This is my first book. Book was published. And 1 month after the book is published, my parents own a small bookshop in Delhi, and this Sikh gentleman comes into the bookshop and he says, I need to speak to the writer of this book. My mother, who is there, she's just really perturbed. She says, immediately she assumes that I've offended somebody in the book. So she says, listen, I'm really sorry, what has happened? She's my daughter, I will take responsibility. So in my first book, there are photographs. Each chapter opens with a photograph, and there is a photograph of this house. There's a black and white photograph, and then the colored photograph that, anyway, the colored photograph later. But there's a black and white photograph. So the Sikh gentleman says, this is the house that I live in. This is my house. And the minute my mother tells me that, I burst into tears, of course. But then I call Mrs. Ali in Pakistan and I say, I found your house. You're going to see your house. And she is so sweet. She says, oh, I hope they're going to send us some photographs of the house. I said, they're going to do more than that. You just wait. So I set up a meeting with these 2 brothers who are just so lovely. And, they want to ask me how I know about their house, because these are really intimate details about a house that you live in. And we meet, and during the course of the meeting, I invite myself to that house, naturally. And I drive from Delhi to Dalhousie, which is like hours and hours and hours. And I cannot explain to you what it feels like when you've heard of a story about a place that you never thought existed. You see that place in front of you, and just the sheer conviction and belief in the power of memory is so incredible, because there was the house. It is called Kehkishan, which in Urdu means galaxy. The woman who I was speaking to, her name is Sitara Ali. Her sister's name is Suraya, which is another word for Surya. Their father was obsessed with galaxies. He built this house as a constellation with stars and, kind of observatory, rounded features. It was just stunning. The ceilings had stars engraved into them. I mean, the light, he thought about everything. And here was this house from the past. And now that I was there in Dalhousie, I wanted to find out everything I could, including the stories of the family who moved there. They had their own stories about why they were allotted this property after partition. They were also a partition family. And then we went to the municipal office. The thing with pre-partition buildings, I'm sure this is the case in Calcutta also, is that there are documents available because the Brits did a great job of preserving them. However, the municipal office was like some sarkari office, so you can imagine what it was like. And there was this clerk, and he said to me, "Ki madam, aapko to milne nahi wali hain ye buildings. Inke papers hi nahi hain." There was just a room, maybe like 1/4 this size, just filled to the brim with papers and papers and papers that hadn't been sorted in decades. And I said that I will do it with you. So the whole day we spent looking through these papers. And sure enough, we found a file that said cottages of Mia, what was his name? Mia Faiz Ali or something like that, I'm forgetting now. And there was Kehkeshan. And that file had blueprints. And that file had letters, because it's so difficult to construct in the hills. He had written letters to the municipal office saying, "May I get permission to remove 3 tosh trees? I want to build an extension to my kitchen. I want to build a servant's quarter." Everything was written. His signature was there. And then I was taking photographs, and this clerk is like, "Photo nahi le sakte, ma'am." I was like, "Yeah, I'm taking photos." And I sent them to Mrs. Ali, and she was weeping. And the weird thing was, the architect that built that house also built my grandfather's house. So it just, I never expected that. Anyway, oh my God, it was so weird. It was not an enemy property swap. Right. Yeah. I don't think it was called that though. Yeah. It was called evacuee property. Yeah, exactly. Enemy is such a hostile word. Yeah. Right. It was evacuee property, exactly. So,
But listen, you have to listen to the end and make it quick,
right,
Aanchal. We have a long way to go.
Right. So the real reason was to get Mrs. Ali to see the house. So I organized a Skype call with the family I was staying in the house and Mrs. Ali. And you know, when they start, like, there was a nervousness to the call, because the Sikh family is like, "Sat Sri Akal," and Mrs. Ali is like, "Assalamu alaikum beta," and they don't really know what to say, because these are not a Pakistani and an Indian family, not a Muslim and a Sikh family. They're just two families that share the history of a home, one that built it and one that preserved it. And what are the things that they talk about? Is the scratch that I left in the dining table still there? Did you find the hidden compartment in the desk? Do you want to know why the kitchen is so weird? Like, these are the conversations they were having. And I took a seat back. I just wanted them to speak. But at the end, the Sikh family tells Mrs. Ali that, "I hope you can come and spend the summer in our house." And it just felt incredible to witness that. Yeah.
Fabulous story. That can be a book in itself, actually. Anchal, it's going to be a tough question I'm going to ask you, not an easy one. And that is, one of the criticisms of the book of Everlasting Things, and I must here preface my question by gesturing towards the ladies' study group, very well-read ladies, who invited me to read this book and present this book to them when I had no idea that this book existed. Absolutely thrilled. But many of them too pointed out to me, as did our book club members, that this book uses partition perhaps, but it is not really what it is touted to be. No fault of the writer, but how do you balance the fact that this is really a wonderful love story that it's not really a book about partition? What would you say to that?
I have said publicly on multiple forums, it's not a partition book, despite what my publishers say. It is not a partition book. It is a book that has partition in it. I will agree with everyone that criticizes it. I will agree with everyone that criticizes the back also. It is not a partition book. It is a book that has partition as one of the landscapes. Like it has Scent as a landscape, World War I as a landscape. It has, honestly, the number of times I have described this book as a family history far surpasses the number of times I've said, yes, it's a love story. The main protagonists for me are Samir and his uncle Vivek. Rather than Samir and Firdaus, yes, it is a love story. It is a love story for Samir and Firdaus. It is a love story for Vivek and Amrit. But it's a family story, and it is a story of a society that's ruptured. So I agree with your criticism.
Can I
yes.
say something here?
Yes.
Is it possible to...
We'll come back to you in a second, because otherwise we sort of, miss the drill. Hold the thought. We'd love to hear that. So, taking it from there, taking it from your argument, for me, this book is really about space. How a place is recaptured, a la Salman Rushdie, who says that imaginary homelands, what you were talking about a little while ago. And I think what is so crucially haunting and very audacious of you as a writer is to be able to recreate homelands of the mind. Not real houses, real villages, real streets, but as Rushdie says, we've all been cut loose and we are floating in the air, and we want so much to be anchored again in a place which is our home. I think that's what makes this such a unique manner of telling the story of partition.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I also agree with you. Well, I'm really grateful for that comment about it not being a partition novel, by the way. Thank you. Because it's true. Sometimes you can't really argue with publishers. Right? There is negotiation you have to make as a writer as well. And I appreciate that. And it is very much a love story, but it goes beyond that, as does the story of partition go beyond just one thing. Right? And of the migrations that follow before and after. Yeah.
Okay, so for the next phase of our evening's exploration, it is a great pleasure, really, to pay respect. This is our 34th meeting. We've had Booker Prize winners. We've had people who've been nominated for the Nobel. But Aanchal, it is such a pleasure, literally, because you are such an articulate human being. You bring so many aspects of different disciplines to the fore, and you make us very proud. So, first to go, as usual, Dr. Choitali Moitro of our book club, our very own, the overview giver, so to speak. We'll try and keep it, as usual, to our 3-minute mark. And after we finish our book club members, I will let the hybrid entrance come, and then we'll open it up to the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you, Julie Di, and good evening, everyone. From what I heard for last 15-20 minutes, a lot has already been said about sort of what crossed my mind. I would just like to say that when you say that it's not a partition book, it's a wonderful truth that you are trying to talk about. And trying to bring that, to establish that, you have given your narrative little waves. You see, at certain places, this narrative is about family, friends, relationships, particularly filial ones, and the insight that, quote unquote, not all love stories end in happiness. But with that wave, there are other waves also, which point out to subversive necropolitics, to dark political shadows, to definitely partition or the suffering that you normally sort of see in the trench fighting. Because trench fighting, in one of our book club meets, we had agreed, Harish, me and Julie, that trench fighting is no longer the sordid reality as it used to be. But you bring it in, especially in the diary entries. Right. And finally, all these waves of your narrative lead to certain broad categories of studies which are happening nowadays. For instance, queer death. For instance, just the South Asian diaspora trying to relate to death, suffering, memory, and so much more. That I thought was very interesting. And I would also like to say a quick word on how you are juxtaposing the art of making perfumes and calligraphy, which I loved. With calligraphy, your mind goes back to medieval calligraphers, and you bring it out so well. So that also, so there is imagined geography with the presence of the Ravi River. You remember? That's what touched my mind a lot. And finally, the making of a perfume. Every perfume that is made has a name. Arzu, Farak. All these names are conglomeration of a feminine type, suffering endlessly and yet giving the best they have. Thank you, madam.
Thank you so much. It was a real privilege to listen to that. It brings up lots of things that I also consider tangentially, but some things I never thought of. Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant, Choitali, as usual. And I think that point about the feminist aspect of certain perfumes and the masculine aspect of certain perfumes, Urmi will shed more light on that, I hope. But now, Dr. Harish Mehta, our resident historian.
Well, thank you so much. And I thought the way you began your book just hooked me. And I think you had the hook. And publishers want the hook, writers want the hook. That the book beginning with the nose waking up before the man, it just got me. And I think there's a lot of very creative, because books are not just about big drama stories. Like the canvases are important. Partition, love stories are all there. But what distinguishes, for me, a good novel from an ordinary one is the tone and the way the story is told. And you did that to me. For me, I thought that was fantastic. And as a historian, as Julie points out frequently, the whole idea of the history of smell, historians are always late in coming into the modern world. So when the world had finished talking about post-colonialism, historians were still in the pre-colonial era, because we work with documents, and we're still waiting for the Clinton era documents to come out. So so we're really backward. It's not our fault, but the release of official documents takes time under various secrets acts, and the CIA is slow. In India, it's very slow. In India, we never see them. At least foreign policy documents are very rarely shown. The archives are there, but there's not very much of substance in them, even in Delhi. So the whole idea of the history of smell, historians of my field, which is the history of American foreign policy, have suddenly a few years ago woken up to the idea, yes, that history can be excavated through smell. And there was a great amount of excitement and debate, and some people said that's not audacious, that is, what's that other word, heretical, to suggest that historians will now tear them away, their bodies from the archive, and now start smelling empire, where empire can be smelled. And then they said, no, it's not just the smell. The empire also had a hearing thing. So, we can, the history of the empire can be heard. So there was smell, there was all, and you can taste the empire, because the empire couldn't eat our food. Our chilies were too hot for them. And so we were late. But I thought that your book with the history of smell would be very appealing to some of the late coming historians.
Oh God, no! I would leave that to a perfumer. I learned recently the Gandha Shastra has a lot of really interesting things. When we think of archive, we often just think of Western archive, but Indian archives, particularly, really they have just incredible knowledge. So I was speaking to a perfumer the other day, and she said to me, "Oh, did you know that there's a perfume for the dead?" I said, "What are you saying?" And she said, "Oh, in the Gandha Shastra, so and so and so. And in the Gandha Shastra, at this point, there's this smell in this day." And I just thought to myself, God, you must write this book. So there are people far more qualified than me. I will say this, the more you smell, the better you smell. right? But there's really nothing quite like a trained nose. Yeah. So I'm going to put it out in the world and hope that someone writes. There is a really beautiful book called Sandalwood and Carrion, though, about the history of smell in India. Yeah.
If I might just add a little trivia to that, you know, when we do the snana ritual for the Devi, in the Durga Saptarshi, we have 10 kinds of mati, mrittika, and we have 10 kinds of water from 10 different rivers. And when you mix that mrittika with the river water, each gives you a different fragrance. So the goddess is all perfumed. Anasuya, do you have a mic? Yeah. So,
Yeah.
Anasuya,
So,
go ahead.
Thank you, Julie. And Aanchal, I really enjoyed your book. And there's, like Chaitali said, it's a story on so many levels. And while we were discussing, she said it's also a very linear story. So yes, it did progress quite in a linear manner, and it was very easy to continue with the book because it's a big one and I had to put it down several times. As a reader, I looked forward to going back to it each time, and I thought you did an exemplary job for a first novel. A little query though, you did mention in your interview with Julie in the T2, some of the stories I recorded as an oral historian, very much rooted in reality, read like fiction, unimaginable. On the other hand, some of the scenes from my novel, constructed, imagined, feel utterly real. So what you're telling us is that the truth was unbelievable, and yet the fiction was quite acceptable. And I just want to take it a little way deeper into one of the situations in your book where Samir tells his mother Savitri that he has feelings for Firdaus. So the backdrop is a divided society where Sikhs and Hindus live in a separate part of the city, and the Muslims live in a separate part. And here he is going to learn calligraphy to the Muslim part of the city, and he's professing love for his teacher's daughter. And at the same time, Firdaus tells her father that she has received a gift of love on her birthday from Samir. So let's just imagine the scenario in today's world. We are in 2023. It really is not imaginable that any girl will have the courage to go and tell her father that she has fallen in love with a Muslim, a Hindu girl. And so also for a Hindu boy to go and tell his mother that he has fallen in love with a Muslim girl. But this is in 1940. And the ease with which each could tell their parent and bare their heart. So is that fiction, or is it something you desire to see in society? Is that what you reflected in your writing? What is it?
I think it's not so easy to paint everything with a single brush.
True.
Right? There's no single story of the past or the present. We may see what's happening in the news today and say, oh God, yeah, it's not possible today. How is it possible? How was it possible then? But we only hear the stories where things are not possible. The number of stories that I've recorded from the 40s, from the 30s of interfaith marriages this is what it is. I was not making anything up. These are real stories that people have told me. And it was not easy for Samir or Firdaus to tell either of their parents. You remember the context where each of those things happened. Samir goes through great personal turmoil throughout the day, laboring over what has happened politically, and then going to the distillery and trying to sort of throw himself into things like flowers and woods and water and odor. Firdaus chooses in that moment to be her mother's daughter rather than her father's daughter.
Yes.
So there is great mental
Trauma.
consideration, and trauma, of course. The same that would happen now, if at all. It's just that the situation is different. It's not really comparable, right? Some would say that. Also, I mean, this is the thing. I don't want to say one thing. I don't want to say one thing for everybody, right? I am very wary not to categorize Partition as one single story. There's a danger in that. When you homogenize an experience, you literally discredit thousands of other voices that go against that experience. So this is why oral history is such an incredible resource, because it allows people to tell these various stories and for us to consider various perspectives of the same event with dignity and respect, right?
But perhaps the prejudice at that time was more limited, because Savitri chooses to give the filigree bottle to the son. And Altaf, appreciates the daughter's love for Samir and appreciates Samir.
But it's more complicated
It
because
is very
he
complicated.
goes against his own better judgment,
He
right?
did go against his better judgment in his upbringing of his daughter,
Yes.
right from the time when she was quite little.
Right.
So in that period, so it's opened a window for all
Yeah.
of us to think that society was actually quite, people were struggling to be permissive then.
Some
achieving
people.
it.
Some people. No, I
Yeah.
wouldn't say all people. Because in Firdaus's house, there are 3 people that live in that house.
Yes.
I would say, like, sometimes I think Zainab is the most, she is the person that has the most far-reaching thoughts, because she has considered the possibility of a future arc
Yes.
of history and wants to take life into her own hands, wants to make the decision that will make her daughter happy and successful.
Yes.
But Altaf is a dreamer, right? And eventually he does give in to his wife Zainab, but you see to what consequence that is, right? I think a lot about these 3. Sometimes I think, like, Zainab is probably the truest character, actually. Most true to reality.
True.
Yeah.
So an addendum, to this one, if I might. I wonder if you've read A Heart Divided, Mumtaz Nawaz, right? So I would rate it the best partition love story book, among several others. And there, both the lovers came from elitist families with a strong political connect. I haven't had the privilege of reading your current book. I have the previous 2. So would you say that there was a class angle to a romance working out or not working out? In Heart Divided, they become estranged and part because they have political and or other allegiances to their respective countries, which take precedence over any other, including their emotional involvement. Whereas here it appears that that is not that is not the case. So would you say there is a class and or other responsibility angle that transcended any of these?
Well, from Firdaus's side, her mother very much supports the Muslim League and tries everything she can to get her husband also to join, and her daughter as well. Samir's family, on the other hand, comes from the economic majority of Lahore, which is Hindus and Sikhs. Not to say that they are the most wealthiest, because there are several wealthy Muslim families as well, but they just have the economic majority at the time. Obviously, their love story also does not end in a happy note because of partition, but they lose different things. I don't think that's because of their class. I think it's because of their identity. Samir loses more than Firdaus. You would say Samir loses physically more than Firdaus. Firdaus loses everything else. She loses intellectual freedom. She loses everything that her father has given her up till then. He takes it away. I don't know whose loss is bigger in the long run, but I don't know if it's a class thing. I would say that it's an identity, like the religious identity, particularly for Firdaus, was very important. Her family's identity was very important, and she eventually gave in to that. But it's a really good observation, yeah, for sure.
I think, Anasuya, you've managed to ferret out a very serious, thought-provoking issue here. Was it really more liberal in some ways then than now? Because we've both discussed this many times. Those who have children and who are involved in multi-religious relationships which are serious have not always do not always bear the fruit of happiness, you know. But
so I think partition memory has percolated down to everybody.
of course.
And the horror of it.
Of
So
course.
that plays in the background. It's in our DNA, and therefore prejudice is perhaps more now than it was then.
In my second book, I look at this. But one of the stories that my grandmother's sister, my nani's sister, told me was when we were talking about this, her house burned down in Lahore, like Sameer's house. Sameer's house is modeled on my nani's house, which burned down in the summer of 47. But then my grandmother said to me, her sister, she said, you know that in the 60s, my younger brother married a Muslim girl. I said, yeah, I know. And she said, you know that my mother was really against it because they eloped, they ran away and got married. The mother was really against it because it brought up all those memories of partition. And then she said, my father said, and my husband, so my nani's sister's husband and her father, said, if you don't accept this girl today, then everyone else will reject her tomorrow. But if you accept her today, no one else will say anything. And that's exactly what happened, right? To a point where I didn't even know that Anu Nani was a Muslim until last year. Last year. When my youngest Nana died, that's when I found out. It didn't really matter, but that's an idyllic sitting, right? It's not going to happen to everybody.
I think one aspect that gets lost when we say partition is a genocide aspect of it. That there was no UN supervision of such large transfers of populations. It was so arbitrary, and the killings were so well orchestrated in the absence of organized police, military presence on the ground, that it allowed these hostile groups on both sides, so much time to actually indulge in premeditated killings. And still, we talk about partition as some sort of, happy for the elites, they came over in aircraft or ships, and not so happy for the poor who actually were bludgeoned while they were being transported, that we forget. And I think there's not much scholarly work being done. I've seen some before coming for your talk today. I Googled and found that there were only one or two articles that explored the genocidal aspects of partition. I think and also this whole idea of diaspora, whether what happened here is a form of diaspora, that populations flew this way and that way, and then, how many of us went helter-skelter years later when, it was possible for us to go to America, as many of the partition's grandchildren like yourselves and us. Me too, I'm a partition grandson. So,
well, I think Choitali and I have, we have a affinity for Train to Pakistan, Kushwant Singh's book. We can go on about this, but I think we should move on. Sangeeta, I always think of you as the person with the nose for the top note. So tell us what you thought of the book. I'm sorry, but I have to push you now to stay within a time limit, please. Thank you.
Congratulations. Actually, it's so wonderful to see such a young lady writing such an all-encompassing book. I really enjoyed the book. As Julie said, my profession is all about my nose. Yeah. And by the grace of God, I've also been blessed with an ability to smell. In fact, I've got this habit of sniffing everything. Both my husband and I are tea tasters. When I go to a leather shop, I start smelling all the bags to see which is the better leather. When I go to a bookshop, I start smelling books. And so I've always used my nose. So for me, this book was about perfume and love. This was, the spine of the book. And the way you've related smell to every aspect of the story is brilliant. Like when they visited that rose place and the smell of the roses coming in the distance. Then when they go to Kannauj, on the way, I think that's where you smell the earth. Where is it? The ittar,
exactly.
yeah,
Mitti ittar.
mitti ittar, and the way you did the smell of rain on the earth, and of course I love the way you have just liberally thrown in local language without any, sometimes with explanations, sometimes without it, and that must be really fascinating foreign readers, and I found that a very interesting aspect of the book. But yeah, for me, this was all about smell and calligraphy. Actually, I travel a lot to Iran, and I've seen calligraphy is a very big part of their culture. And all the young ladies there, they do calligraphy. So Firdaus really reminded me of those young Iranian women. And this marriage of calligraphy with perfumery was beautiful.
It's incredible. Thank you. Yeah.
That was really nice. Of course, the contents of your book make for a wonderful movie, I have to say. To just sort of landscape the book, I would also say that I didn't find Partition, apart from breaking the families apart and taking them in different things, I didn't really find it the central part of the book. And also, the second half of the book, which is, say, like the last 150 pages, encompassed like 3-4 generations, whereas the first half of the book was much more detailed. And of course, although the second half is all in Grass, which is the perfume capital, I never got the essence of smell and thing as much as I did in Lahore and in India. Here it was much more multifaceted, much more fascinating than it was in Grass. So,
do you think that we have, as people of the subcontinent, different associations to smell than Western perfumers do to their land?
I think it pervades more aspects of our life than it. I think for them it's more decorative. For us, like even cooking and
right, there is a sanctity to smell, not only a devotional aspect of it, but in other things as well.
Yeah, incense, and
that's one. But like you
talking
said,
about dead, Tata UD cologne. Well, I always used to say, please don't give me Tata UD cologne because it reminds me of the dead. It's so, and white tube roses. Like I don't. So those sort of associations are there. And of course, like we discussed, every smell takes us back to a phase in our lives, just like music does.
Absolutely.
And a person in our lives, an experience in our lives. So that aspect you just brought out beautifully from the beginning to the end. And I really enjoyed it. And it's really it was like an assault on my senses, because smell is such a primal sense. And as you said, you can't see it, but it's all pervading and it's so basic. So I'm really enthused, and I really want to do a course on perfume. I always wanted to do one, and I'm going to speak to you about the lady and see if I can do this course. So yeah, I'll end at that and say it was a beautiful book, and the first half was much more impactful than the second half. Yes, Sameer's life was actually a shadow of his uncle's in so many ways. In so many ways, it was the journey.
I'm really glad you said that, because that's how it's written, that every decision he takes is actually mediated by someone who is dead. And it's a very crippling kind of existence, to try and match up to the experiences or try and put together a life belatedly. But also the second half of the book is really Sameer in very unfamiliar territory, away from his land, and trying to become a perfumer again without his uncle.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So there is a distance from his own landscape there.
Yes.
There you go with post-memory again, right? Yeah.
And as a keeper of memories, you have done a brilliant job, because you give the impression that you've experienced it yourself, which is really amazing.
Thank you,
So
Sangeeta.
congratulations.
Thank you so much. Urmi, the floor is all yours. But you always have a very eclectic and a very wealthy input. My only request is keep it very short, Urmi. Urmi is our chemical engineer. We were in university at Jadavpur for a year together. And she really is cracked up to be all she stands for. Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Hi, Anchal. Your book was a very nice read. It was very special. And I think most of the people have covered most of the points. But I would like to take a few different points and point out a few different points. I think the way that you have, ultimately encapsulated almost 100 years, you have said from early 1900, 1912, 1914, right up to 2014, you have actually covered 4 generations. And what I'm trying to say is, I could actually see one thing very clearly expressed. It is the way that, Samir had learned about perfumes from Vivek uh, in the as an art in the form of Guru Shishya Parampara, which is very much prevalent in Hindustan and in erstwhile Hindustan and present India, Pakistan. And later, when she actually gave the same knowledge and transferred it from Samir to Anauk, to his granddaughter, I felt though the time had elapsed for 100 years, the way that perfume, the art of perfume, and any art of that quality and caliber, whether it is, classical music or whether it is perfumes of this level, of how much each one has to be, titrated in the words of chemistry, what we will say, to get out the final result, was actually hasn't really changed. Only then you get something of that, quality and level. And I'm trying to say you have come out with that very well. And also one more thing I wanted to observe, I had observed, is that, you have actually said that, earlier it was like a joint family where Samir was actually staying with his grandfather in the early 1900s with Somnath, his grandfather, and his, uncle Vivek. And, the love that Vivek bestowed on Samir was just like his own son, because Samir did not know that he had a daughter who had not, taken birth. But the fact is, he was actually giving his absolute love and affection as his own child and teaching every little detail about it. And in the same manner, when Samir was teaching Anauk in Paris, it was a nuclear family, but still it didn't matter. She was actually bestowing the knowledge in the same manner. Now, I, as a chemical engineer, I have one question to you. So this is my inference, which I found that very nice. So I had a question for you. You have actually written about the distilleries, where, you put so many petals together and actually sort of, in the early 1900s, they were actually distilling it and then, condensing it and then getting it into receivers. And there was insulation with coils and things like that. No, I wanted to know, even now I know about distillation columns and, pressure vessels, which we have used, and how technology has advanced. How did you find out about what was happening at that time?
It's because it hasn't changed.
No. My question is
India,
different. I'm trying to say, in those days, I mean, somebody would have related to you the story and how it was. I mean, who was it that you got this information from?
I worked with a distillery in Kannauj who have been making perfumes for 8 generations in the exact same way. It has not changed even today. They do the exact Deg Bhapka technique that they did 1900s, 1800s, and they have stayed very true to that mechanism of distillation. Yeah. So I spent time there, which is how I got to know about Mitti Ittar also, and how I saw the diggers working with their hands.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Urmi, thank you for your input. And
thank you.
Anchal's answer, I think, opens up, another Pandora's box all over again and relates it to the fact that she is rooted in real research. So there is reality and there is magic. In some way, it's magic realism. Dr. Paramita Mukherjee Malik, very much one of our star contributors to the Bengal Club Book Club. She has been a member for a long time. She's a poet and a scientist. So Paramita, go right ahead.
Aanchal, as a poet, I was just fascinated with your book. The first 2 parts, I have named it The Romance and Poetry of Perfume. because it's so well written. And, you know, I didn't realize that there was so much poetry in perfumes. So much poetry in perfumes. I could write like Alif Laila. I could compose 1001 poems out of your book. And now I'll come to the partition part. I think I am with Anusua when she says that, you know, a Hindu and a Muslim, when they are in love, I think that era, they were much more liberal. I felt from your writing, they were much more liberal in Lahore when they were coexisting together. And maybe the partition has brought some divide in religions. I feel that. I felt that. And again and again, I wanted a phrase which would, you know, again and again, I felt that many layers, many obstacles in my heart went totally off with your book. You know, I felt a more liberated and liberal person after reading your book. That in one sentence, it is in your book that we are all children of the same earth. There is no Muslim, no Hindu, no Sikh, no Christians. We are the children of the same earth. So that is what fascinated me, just fascinated me. Throughout the book, I felt we are humans. That is it. We have no religion. And that is amazing, amazing. Like, it's an amazing book. And one more thing, Aanchal, one tiny little minute, Julie, please give me one more minute. I just
Go ahead.
love
Half a minute, half a
Yes,
minute.
loved where you talk about the Mughals, how they have, you know, we are trying to endorse some part of history, but history cannot, we are trying to erase some part of history, but history cannot be erased. So you have brought in Mughals, that how Akbar, he used some kind of perfume, and Zebunisa, my daughter is here today, she's also listening. So we share memories together, my daughter and I. We had seen the Zebunisa's own calligraphied poetry in Asiatic Society, Calcutta. So, you know, there you mentioned Zebunisa's poetry book, which was like, she was the last years of her life, 21 years of her life, Aurangzeb, her father, had imprisoned her. So you bring a large part of the history which we are trying to erase off. So that was a brilliant thing in this book again.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
so much,
That's so
Aanchal. It
kind
was
of you.
amazing.
Thank you.
Excitement.
No, thank you.
1 minute. I just want to, yeah. Thank you so much, Paramita. That always is, you know, out of the box. Wonderful. Okay, so let me get my ducks in a row. There's Ragini, there's Vinod Pillai, there's Smita there. Okay, so let's go with Smita, and then we will come back to see who. We will get Chris Marsh as well. Chris, would you like to say a few words on the book and on the discussion before I go to Smita, Dr. Smita Kothari from Canada? Go ahead, and then we'll come back to Ragini.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. I was particularly fascinated by the character of Vinayak. I felt that he was a thread that linked the whole story together. I was also fascinated by his relationship with his brother Mohan and his friendship with
Altaf.
Rahi.
Altaf, with Altaf.
But one of the things that really, I was also struck by how it seemed to me that as a tactic you had chosen to avoid the blood and gore of partition and what happened, you know, which was horrific. And you chose instead to give us very vividly the blood and gore of the First World War. And that seemed to me a very important authorial choice that you made. And it was as if this was a substitute. And the character of Vivek, as I say, linking the whole story together, he experienced the trauma that was the result of the politics of the power of the British Empire, which I feel sort of desperately ashamed of, you know, being British, it's awful. I sort of want to beg forgiveness, but it's as if he is the channel through which the relationships of power and trauma and suffering, and also rebellion, choosing to walk out of the situation and make another life. I just thought he was the most fascinating character, and I wondered if you could say something about him.
I'm really glad you said that, because almost all the discussions I've had with people are always about Samir and Firdaus, but there is no Samir without Vivek. Samir notes this later in the book where he says, had my uncle not come here, I would not be here. Actually, Samir sees the world because of Vivek. And he goes into everything from self-exile to wrecking his own marriage because of his uncle. Everything is dictated by him. There is guilt, there is love, there is hope, there is aspiration to reach, to recover, to piece together. Everything is because of him. And I don't think Samir realizes this until the very end, because it ends with him looking at the journals and then him smelling the perfume. It begins and ends with Vivek. It has to. There's no other way. There's no other way. I'm really happy you picked up on that. A lot of the character of Vivek, physically, he was the first character I thought of. And there's a story for why I thought of him. There's a chemist in this group. You just spoke. Yeah. So my Nana was a chemist for Dabur. My grandfather was a chemist for Dabur, and he used to make soaps and shampoos and all sorts of stuff that they make. And he used to get these little vials of fragrances to use in them. So they would be like papaya and aloe and apple and all that stuff. Or they would be like weird things called Rambo and fruit salad. And, he would use them in his office, and whatever was left over, he would bring back. And in the summertime in India, we use coolers. We all use coolers. He would put that remaining perfume in the water of the cooler. So one day the house would smell of rose, another day it would smell of khas, a third day it would smell of papaya. And this one person going out of their way to make a fragrant and amorous environment for a whole family, it was such a beautiful thought. And that's what Vivek does, right? So Vivek's physical appearance is very much like my grandfather. My grandfather didn't go to war. I was about to use his name in the book as well, but then he was like, oh, people will think I went to war. And I said, well, if you went to war, you'd be dead by now. So that wouldn't work. But also like Vivek's wife, her name is Amrit. Vivek calls her Amrit, which is my grandmother's name. They were married on the same day. She also died early. There are things that I've taken from real life. We discussed that, real life and fiction. We discussed that as well. That make his character so personal, so intimate, so necessary for me. And by that extension, Samir as well. Samir is my anchor, but Samir does not exist without the water that is Vivek. Right?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Chris Marsh, that was quite enlightening. And thank you, Aanchal, for the luminosity. Dr. Smita Kothari, are you there?
Yes, Julie.
Yes, you are. Now, thank you for waking up early. Thank you for your patience. You always have. So please go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you, Julie, for hosting this, and Aanchal for this amazing book. I was just blown away and kept going back to this is her first novel. But now, and as I was reading the book, the thought as an ethnographic researcher, the thought of your research really, how did she come to this perfumery, and how did she, it was all just mind blowing. The central character, which Chris just brought up in my mind, was Vivek, whose journals really, Samir is living his life through the journals of Vivek from the time of literally both him and his wife getting into the journals At a point when she gives up, it's too morbid for her, and he takes off on this journey. And I felt like I was going on this journey with him. I wanted to traverse all the lands you talk about in the novel. I wanted to go as somebody who's constantly aware of perfumes in flowers. I'm a big gardener and don't have a garden anymore, but the smells and the lavender fields and the rose fields. Grass is a place I've never been, but would love to. Lahore is a place, as an Indian, in our mind, a not permitted place. But most of the points have been raised. What I wanted to is go back to somebody in the audience who talked about the Hindu-Muslim relationships of then and now. And part of the contribution of the hardening of ties to the communities in the current situation, I feel, is the Hindu nationalism within the context of India, and how that divisive rhetoric is so contributing to the non-liberal thing. And the last thing I want to say is about houses. When you talk about the Sikh family and Mrs. Ali, my brother-in-law lives in Malabar Hill in Mumbai, just minutes from the Jinnah house. And when I'm there, I walk that hill up to Hanging Garden and this empty, beautiful colonial house, and what kind of memories it evokes. I know there's a dispute between memories, the memory of smell, the mitti smell. It brings me back to my childhood and standing in the balcony in Delhi when after monsoons, the smell of the earth is a very distinct smell that we don't get somehow. I don't know. I don't get that smell in the West, having left my motherland.
There's a scientific reason for that as well. I should. Okay.
Anyway, thank you for the great book, Aanchal.
Thank you.
You mentioned the story about the British colonel and the Sondha Mitti in your other book.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. What he missed the most was the smell of that mitti on his leather shoes. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for remembering that.
Thank you. Thank you, Smita, as usual, incandescent. And thank you, Viva. Mr. Vinod Pillai, very strong contributor, avid reader, great analysis. Look forward. Vinod, please keep it short, but would love to hear you.
Thank you, Julie, and good evening, everyone. Thank you, Aanchal, for a lovely book. I enjoyed it. Now, I've prepared some notes so that I don't, breach the 3 minutes that Julie gives. I felt that this book, to me, it seemed like a sadhya. So let me just explain. The Kerala Sadhya is a feast for festivals and special occasions, consisting of a very wide variety of vegetarian dishes, some fried, some curried, some steamed, some pickled, some papad, and of different flavors, some bland, some pungent, some sour, some sweet, all served on a plantain leaf and savored turn by turn for a full gastronomic experience. The Book of Everlasting Things for me is a sadhya that is served on the platter of partition, with the full range of experiences and flavors of life, of falling in love and separating, of being in a trench on the war front, of connecting with strangers and separating from one's own, of partition and self-imposed exiles, of intoxicating fragrances and nauseating stench, of inspiring music and cries of pain, of tender love, separation, guilt, hatred, courage, cowardice. There is so much going on in this roller coaster ride with constantly changing, contrasting settings and experiences that it kept me engrossed till the very end. Great storytelling. The yin and yang principle, I thought, played out powerfully in the characters of Samir and Firdaus, because Samir, who is a Hindu and a great nose like his uncle, and Firdaus, a Muslim, who we discover later is, hyposmic. Samir, who spends most of his life away from Hindustan, and Firdaus, who stays rooted in Lahore all her life. And of course, though disconnected, they stay connected in the background throughout the story until the end, and end their life's journey at around the same time to unite up there in the skies where Firdaus would be waiting. It's difficult to find flaws, but there's one thing that I'll mention. Let me put it like this, that even though Petrichor or Sondi Khushbu transports me to my childhood, I don't have very refined sensibilities or knowledge of fragrances, and so found the perfume making exercise a bit tiring. It was definitely very interesting in the beginning, but as I went through it again and again, I found myself rushing through those parts without savoring it. Perhaps it's my own limitation, or maybe the story was too gripping to let me stray into unknown worlds. I don't know. But one thing I know for me, overall, the Book of Everlasting Things seemed a great composition, as great as the best of compositions of Vivek and Samir. So thank you very much once again. Thank you, Julie, for giving me this opportunity.
Always a pleasure. Thank you. Mr. Gurudas, before we give over to Ragini and Shuddhadeep and whoever else is here, and Professor Shutanuka Ghosh Roy, I would very much like us to hear what our book club member, Mrs. Anju Munshi, has sent us. Do you have the clip?
Good evening, everybody. So nice to be amidst you all. Well, it was a great experience to be living with the Witch family for 10 days. It was a great experience to be making perfumes and fragrances with them. That's the kind of an impact the book had on me. I enjoyed reading it, participating in their kind of activities, and also understanding the nuances and the bits of the perfume making industry. It was a great thing. Two things which struck me. One was that the author has very, I could actually see, a very careful manipulation by way of no glossing in the narrative. I would call it a kind of a defiance, a very virtuous and a wholesome defiance, a willfulness, a very attractive disobedience that the author's style shows. It is, there were no translations, no italics, no, like those things which the writer always makes an effort to make the readers understand. It was like take it or leave it kind of an attitude, a very carefully careless approach in the narrative, and I quite liked it. Like Dussa is Dussa, Vilaiti is Vilaiti. There is no effort, no attempt to translate it to the readers. Kalam, Samir, Puttar, Intiha, except some conversations which is put in, italics. Two, I think the entire process of, explaining the association of a fragrance with our emotions and our memories is a fabulous thing. And it made me understand that the perfumes are so powerful that they take us into the inner recesses of our mind, into the dark corridors of our mind, which we think we have forgotten, but actually we haven't, because there are little pockets inside our mind which helps us store our memories. There is a technical term for it which I don't remember as of now. I in fact remember deja vu, I think that could be the same experience as what is suggested in the book, a little whiff taking you back to your experiences, your memories, your certain emotions. That was a very nice thing, and I think that if used in the right way could also aid our healing process. There are times when you understand that this is a reminder of some particular incident in my mind, but you're not very careful, you're not very mindful about it. So that is the time to sit back, take stock of yourself and understand, go back in time. I think that could really work very well in our healing and in our understanding ourselves. It could be a part of a self-exploration exercise. I won't take much time. Thank you very much, to everybody who's listening, and thank you very much to the author for introducing us to this very subtle, very important sense, which is the sense of smell. Thank you so much.
May we move on to Professor Shutanuga Ghosh Roy and hear what she has to say.
Good evening. Thank you, Julie, for the opportunity, and it's great to meet Aanchal, whose book, was with me like a trance. And what struck me the most is the language, since I am a student of who deals with words. So, this is not something which we called Indian writing in English, but this is Indian English. This puttar, this mitti, you don't need to translate. She was saying. So, this has given an age, since this is your debut novel, but I can see that a star, literate star has been born, so expecting more from you. It's a wonderful book, and I'm so thankful to Julie for making me read this wonderful book. Okay, so thank you all.
Many people have mentioned the italics. I think I should address it. It's a conversation I had with many of my editors, both in America and in India. I was not interested in italicizing any of our words because this is how we speak. In my house, people are called puttar. We say all these words and we don't italicize them in our speech. However, someone also mentioned that there are italics when there are sentences. This is a rule that we had to follow, a stylistic rule of publishing house where there are more than a certain number of Indian words, they have to be italicized. But it gives me great pleasure to say the first champion of non-italicizing the words in my novel was my American editor. She was the one that said there's no need. If they don't understand it, they don't understand it. Mm-hmm. So her name is Caroline Bleak. She's incredible. I have to say, though, sometimes I make a mistake of reading reader reviews of my book. From time to time, we all do it. And many Americans have said how they wish there was a glossary, to which I'm like, well, if you don't understand it, then you don't understand it. It's
Go
okay.
look it up. That's what we say.
Well, some people have said I Google too much, and I just think it's, as Indian readers, we go out of our way to understand everything that is not ours.
Yes.
I don't think the onus of a white writer explaining to a white writer should be on us. It should definitely be on them.
Well, Empire, the book that you're invoking in me today is what we have all read. I think Professor Anuradha Chatterjee is there and all of you. You sort of grind your teeth on it as a grad student in the West, and that is a book called The Empire Writes Back, which is Bill Ashcroft and Helen Tiffin. All of them said that you do not need to explain the vernacular. Those who want to know it will know it. So let's have a word from Shutadeep. Shutadeep, what is your view of this book? Because I know you've been following Aanchal's work at Rutgers University, and let's hear what you have to say.
Thank you, ma'am. It was really nice to hear your responses, Aanchal. My question concerns your practice as an archivist, as a person who listens to oral history. It is a hard task to archive the oral into the written. And when you reimagine the oral as fiction, you have to face certain ethical constraints. So if you can speak some about that, like, she has wonderfully summarized it as careful carelessness. But what other ethical constraints that you have to face to be careful not to exoticize the memories that you are writing about in your fiction?
Very interesting. He's talking about the ethical and the moral issues which we are trained in, right, in the academy.
I think I can speak to that more from my non-fiction than my fiction. Because there are real people's real names and real stories being used as they are in those books.
Yeah, but my question is because fiction is also, because I am looking at fiction as another form of archive, not in the traditional sense of archive. Right. So when you are dealing with memories, that you had researched otherwise, not for the book purpose specifically, you know, do you have to face any ethical constraints in that regard?
Great, okay, that's a great thing. So there are instances in this book that you will also find in my nonfiction. And if those instances have been used in this book, it's in the notes at the back. I want to be transparent about what I use. I was telling Julie earlier this afternoon that there's a scene where Samir goes to Amrit's grave in Ghas, and he sees that Vivek has handwritten that gravestone, and he breaks down and he starts crying. That was a memory that was told to me in Lahore about an ancestor of a friend who came to Samana in Punjab and saw the graves of his parents, and he couldn't believe that there were no gravestones, that he made a block of cement and he wrote in the handwritten. And I've written very clearly about that in my acknowledgements and in the notes. So I don't think I faced any ethical dilemma because I want to be transparent, because that is how my training as a non-fiction writer is. If I do an interview with somebody, Sangeeta's sitting right there, I interviewed her family. After I wrote the story, the first thing I did is send it back to them. Because you're not just transcribing what has been said, you're also translating into a whole other language, and you want to make sure that the emotion but also the intention of what is being said is the same in Hindi, Bangla, Odia, Punjabi, whatever language, into English, right? So I always send the interview back, and the dilemmas to be faced in that sometimes are people say what they want to say, but they don't always like what they read. So a lot of instances in my second book where I'm dealing with the way Partition has culminated even in the present, people are saying certain things based on the heightened, charged environment they're living in now, that they may not want to see written down with their name. And they say, oh, actually, this is not what I meant. I meant it like this. Can you say it like this? And it's great because these discussions are very illuminating, but you also want to be completely transparent about what is being published with someone's real name in a book, and for them to okay that and sign a form and say, yes, I agree. So I try and be as ethical as I can. That's all I can say. Though fiction is an interesting thing. I'd like to talk more about that later, maybe outside of this discussion, yeah.
Did you have to make any alterations because they weren't really happy with
But of course, not so much in my first book. In Remnants, when you're writing about the past being the past, there is distance. But when you're writing about the past bleeding into the present, that's when people want to not only be politically correct, but also socially and ethnographically correct. And it's their name. I can't say, but tumne ye kaha tha aur mujhe pata hai what you mean. It's their name, right? And who am I to say if tomorrow we are living in the age of social media? If tomorrow someone takes a photograph of that page, finds them on Twitter, tags them and says, you said this.
Totally.
Right? You want to be protective of your source, of your interviewee. You want to do justice to what they are saying, and you want to give respect to the fact that they've opened up to you, right? So of course I make the change, yes.
Thank you, Aanchal.
Julie, can I just add that I didn't read this book. I listened to the audio version that I got out of it.
I'm going to let Deepthi know. Thank you.
It was just amazing. I am in love with audio books now. It just and the narration.
Listen to all the ones she's narrated. She's so good.
Smita, I don't know whether I will give you an A+ for that. We were in university together, and I do not expect you to actually take the shortcut.
Well, audiobooks are fantastic, I think, for, I don't know, for me, sitting with my back issues is a challenge, and reading a volume this thick would have been a super challenge, carving out that much time to sit. So I love audiobooks because I walk a lot and I can take them with me, and it's wonderful. So there, I don't know if you got any input on the audio version, and I was surprisingly thrilled that the book was available in audio format.
She won a prize for it, actually.
Did she?
Yeah, she did. She did, yeah.
Wow. Very well narrated.
Thank you, thank you. we have a lady here who works on or worked on Partition. So please go ahead, keep it short because we still have one more voice.
Thank you. I'm Rituparna. As somebody,
Julie.
Thank you, Aanchal, as someone who has worked on Partition for the last 25 years, first as a literary scholar and now as the initiator of a museum project, I can't tell you how much your book has touched me at how many levels. I will principally talk about one thing, about that question of whether it's a partition novel or not, because I would like to problematize that. I'm not saying I'm going to refute that, but I'm going to problematize that. But before anything else, I just want to say that this is a novel of exquisite beauty. And I actually do not see it as a novel of love. I see it as a novel of longing. And longing for many things, just not Samir for Firdaus, but Samir for an earlier self of his, longing for the past, which is always irretrievable, longing for a place, longing for an early India, a version of India that is no more, unfortunately. So it is more than anything else a novel of longing, number one. Number two, the greatest novel, the greatest love of the novel for me is Samir for his uncle, not Firdaus. And the heart and soul of the novel is actually his uncle. Number three, I think you are very good in delineating relationships. And for me, the parts that touched me the most, also for personal reasons, is the places where you talk about love dying or reducing, or when that family is disintegrating. It is one thing that Firdaus never gets Samir, or Samir never gets her, and he's trying to block her out, and ultimately he cannot. And this entire portion with Leah and his daughter, and the way that family disintegrates, and the way you analyze emotions, for me that was the best part of the book actually. But coming to, I just wanted to problematize.
Please keep it short. I still have voices to go through. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the thing is, I want to problematize the question about it being a partition novel or not. And I think this post-memory thing comes again. I was constantly thinking about shadow lines, because there also an uncle and nephew relationship is very important. We have, somebody here mentioned Train to Pakistan. Actually, there is a sub-genre of partition fiction within Indian writing in English, which is as old as Partition. So the first novel was written in 1956 by Khushwant Singh, but thereafter for about 3 decades, and I'm not going into names or anything, but for 3 decades it was actually obsessed with violence. You were talking about the genocide part. It was obsessed with violence, and then a time came, for example, Bend in the Ganges, and then Azadi, which was a bit more about refugee life.
And all the work by Urvashi Butalia.
Now, Urvashi Butalia comes, actually it is more about retrieving oral histories.
Yeah.
It comes in 90s. And in the 90s, what happened was things changed. People were talking about, Anita Desai was talking about keeping the partition as a backdrop. Another criticism for her also was that this is not a partition novel, because she was talking about relationships. And then you had, Ice Candy Man, which actually preempted, in a way, the feminist turn in historiography. So from the 50s to the 80s, initially it was about the immediate consequences of partition, immediate physical consequences of partition and refugee life and rebuilding new lives. And then you have a novel like Shadow Lines, 41 years later, which talks about the border, which talks about one incident, which was 25 years back, after the partition. And it is just a long meditation on the concept of the border. So it completely changes what the notion of partition novel should be.
Aanchal, would you like to respond to that?
I'll just finish in another 30 seconds maybe. And 35 years down the line, you have a novel which is talking about something invisible, perfume. So the way I see the trajectory of the partition novel, it has become increasingly abstract. And I feel it is inevitable in a way. So post-memory works in the way a novelist writes as well, just not archives. So I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Rituparna, I'm always in awe of your insight. There's so much to learn from you and your experience. Thank you.
Yep. So, Aanchal, two things. As I mentioned at the outset, I haven't read your book yet, but I think from all that I've heard, it has the making of a heart divided, or Aag Ki Darya for that matter, which I think is another masterpiece with Partition as the backdrop. But it's, Aag Ki Darya is transgenerational. It starts from Chandragupta Maurya. So, I've had the privilege of visiting Pakistan several times, much like yourself, and also Bangladesh. Would you say that the Hindus left behind, is that also something that you have seen? Would you say that the Hindus left behind in Pakistan in particular are the poorest of the poor? Unlike, say, the Hindus in Bangladesh, who form a part of the middle class as well. My observation was that the Sikhs in Pakistan are middle class as well, or perhaps even rich. But in all my trips to Lahore and several other parts of Pakistan, I've never met a Hindu who's been or who was well-to-do. So I wonder whether the poorest of the poor got left behind.
That's a gross generalization, right? There's a small village in Sindh called Mithi, which is 95% Hindu. They're thriving. They're closer to India than to any large city of Pakistan like Karachi. Similarly, I did meet Hindus in Lahore, though I had to find them. You won't really find many Hindus in Lahore. You're going to find them in Sindh. That's where they stayed behind. And you'll find many Parsis and Christians and Jews as well. But to say like they are the poorest of the poor, that's too much of a generalization without me having done the research to prove that that's the case, right? I would have to speak to enough people to say, yes, this is who got left behind. But in the interviews that I've done, I would not say that. I would say that financial circumstances of people changed, for the worse, for the better, yes, and they kept changing, but also the circumstance of migration from Punjab and migration from Bangladesh is totally different, extending over a far larger period, up until the 90s, in fact, from East Bengal, East Pakistan, East Bangladesh, then Punjab, which can really be conformed from, let's say, March to 47 to like February, March 48. Then the border really got, fortified. Sindh is a totally different story. So I think you would really have to do research focusing on a minority population, which already is very, very less thinning every day due to migrations elsewhere, to prove that point.
Thank you.
I don't know.
Thank you, Aanchal.
Worth considering, though.
I want to give the last word, if I may.
Julie, can I ask, can I?
Yeah, just a minute, Vibha. We have our member here, Mrs. Gidwai. They have lots of stories to share about the partition, but there's never enough time. We have such a vibrant group of people. I would be most grateful, and thank you for your patience.
I've been listening to everybody talk about partition and people coming and going, and I'd just like to share a personal experience. So my grandmother, she had 6 children, and her eldest son. And my grandmother always had this very sad look on her face. I always remember, I can never remember her actually laughing or smiling. So when you're growing up and you hear stories about partition and all of that, you really don't pay attention to it that much. It's only in the later years so maybe when I was a teenager, at that time you study history and you're studying of all this thing. And I remember my mother telling me this, that during partition, her eldest brother, he was in Lahore. So he had sent a telegram to my grandmother saying that, this partition is coming up and I'm going to be coming back to India. I'm coming back. They were from Allahabad. And I'll be on this train and whatever, and I'll be back. And he never ever came back. And she waited and waited, and you know, she waited till she passed away. She always had that hope she'll come back. There are many other stories that you know that about this, but this is something that it really resonates. And your book actually brought all these memories back. No, it's, you know, and thank you, Julie, you know, a lot of people will not like to share a personal thing, but this is something that has always been with me and my sisters, that, you know, we never asked enough questions. That is something that, well, thank you.
Okay, Vibha, go ahead.
Okay, so Aanchal, I for one, I thought of Partition as a context to the novel. And I saw traces of Joanne Harris, who I'm a great fan of. I mean, the whole overarching theme of material, immaterial, tangible, intangible, memories, connections, families. And her novels are also placed in World War II. So I found a huge connection with that. I mean, more than the star-crossed lovers, which is a slightly cliched theme. So were you at any point of time influenced by her? And also I find that Samir is a tragic hero. I think you've been very unjust to him. And
I don't think so.
Of course.
No, I don't think so.
He loses Firdaus, and then his family gets burnt down. He
Yeah.
goes to Paris, and then he finds out that Firdaus didn't have the sense of smell.
Yeah, much
That's the
later
last
in
thing.
life. Yeah.
I mean, I think that was really cruel. He could have died a peaceful death without knowing that.
I think that's what Samir Khan also says to himself, right? Out of all the truths, this is the one that's really going to unravel him. But I think that's life. Like,
it was very, very.
I know, but we always want happy endings, and sometimes, especially with people that were parted at Partition, you actually don't get happy endings. You get a lot of vacuums and voids and hopes and dreams, and you wish like for people to come back, but it's not going to happen.
The whole perspective of his memory changed.
Yeah.
And this was like really the final nail in the coffin, the last.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I know.
Wonderful.
I know.
Wonderful.
I know.
Ragini, I wish I could give you more time with your thesis, but I will ask Aanchal for permission to share her email with you so you can talk to her in detail. Thank you again, Ragini, for all the wonderful insights and the queries. Best of luck with your dissertation. You couldn't have chosen a better subject. Thank you, everyone, on the hybrid mode. Thank you, all of you from across puddles and ponds. Love all of you. Please do come to our next book discussion, which will be on Mother Teresa, none other than Payal Mohanka's wonderful film on the 24th of August. Okay?
How wonderful.
So, au revoir and thanks again. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Before we part, I'd like to offer a vote of thanks from the Bengal Club Book Club. Thank you, Aanchal, Aanchal, we'd like to offer a vote of thanks. Thank you for coming to this club and giving us your gracious presence, sharing your book with us and its background. I'd also like to convey our thanks to our president, Mr. Kunal Sen. And we have had a very successful set of book club hybrid meetings, all thanks to your support to the committee. And of course, the vivacious and riveting anchor, Julie, without whom none of this could have happened. Thank you, Julie, so much. And good night, all of you.